Sounds True presents Already Free. Buddhism meets Psychotherapy on the Path of Liberation. Session 6 with Bruce Tift.
In this session, we'll be discussing relationships. I've worked a lot, both personally and professionally, with relationships. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist. I see probably about half individuals and half couples. And I think the reason that I'm so drawn to this work, so interested in it, is because my experience of relationship has been very difficult, very rich, very provocative. I don't think there's any likelihood it will ever be resolved into a nice, settled experience for me. But it's incredibly alive. And for many of the people I work with, I think that relationship is one of the most alive parts of their life, and also one of the most disturbing. My wife and I met when we were both in the master's program at Naropa in 1977 and got married in 79. So we've been together quite a while. And I think it's probably accurate to say that I have experienced being disturbed in this relationship every day of those 30 plus years. And my wife assures me that that's the same for her. Here's what I mean by that word disturbed. My partner will just be herself, but I'll have a sudden surge of irritation or impatience or anger or critical feelings come up. If I look beneath that, I find sadness. I find feelings of grief. But just my partner being herself is almost guaranteed to touch some sore spot that I have. She's not causing that sore spot, but she's going to, just by being so intimate, so close together, sharing our lives, she's going to push against something that is an unresolved issue for me. My style tends to be one of wanting to feel more in control, competent, self-sufficient, independent. And so any time that somebody who's important to me is not that way, it's very activating for me. And it's very difficult. It's very difficult to have exactly the feelings that I've spent most of my life trying to not feel triggered every day. But the fact that these feelings are being triggered points my awareness to exactly what it is I have to work on if I want to free myself of my own conditioned history and be able to show up in the present moment, choosing my life as an adult rather than reenacting it in terms of my experience as a child. For many years, I kept trying to solve this disturbance, but at some point I decided to commit to this experience, to investigate it and see if it was actually the problem that I was holding it to be. This approach, of course, is very resonant with my Vajrayana Buddhist training, where everything is welcomed as valid, as experience. We don't throw away any experience. And I've found that a very useful approach to both my marriage and also in working with people. Our society's idea of relationship, perhaps like others, I don't know, seems to be, though, that relationship is supposed to be some type of refuge from our difficult lives. In our media, in sort of social expectations and norms, it seems that we often get the message that intimacy is supposed to be warm and supportive and maybe continually sexually passionate, and maybe we'll hit a few bumps at the beginning, but then we're supposed to somehow just sort of coast from there in some way. I just don't find much evidence that this is accurate. I do think that some couples are just very lucky. Just like some individuals win the lottery, some couples win the relationship lottery, and they have, I think, very genuinely positive, passionate relationships. But the large majority of people that I have worked with and known socially struggle with the incredible disturbance and vulnerability that's brought out into the open by an intimate relationship. So in my experience, we all have a type of choice about how to relate to our experience of intimacy. If we want an intimate relationship to be a source of happiness and comfort and security, I think most of us will end up feeling disappointed and maybe even bitter or feeling victimized. The other possibility that makes sense to me is to relate to our experience of intimacy as one of the most powerful vehicles of personal growth or waking up that our culture has. Our culture doesn't really seem to have many options in terms of a viable spiritual path for many people. So I think intimacy is one of the best ways to challenge ourselves to grow or to wake up from a Buddhist point of view. Another way of saying that is that in my experience, intimacy demands authenticity. The closer we are to somebody, the longer we are with them, the more difficult it is to pretend that very deep grief or rage or fear or panic is not being triggered in our relationship. So we all have a choice as we are going along, which is to go into our disturbance or to somehow come up with a type of usually unconscious agreement between both people to ritualize the relationship in a way that allows them to stay together but protects against too much vulnerability. If possible, it makes sense to me to use the unresolvable disturbance of intimacy as a way to free ourselves of our conditioned history so that we can have our life as an adult rather than just reenact our young survival strategies that we developed when we were quite young and immature. So I'd like to step back a bit and put our experience of relationship with one's partner in the context of relationship in general. All relative experiencing is relational. Upon investigation, upon examination, it seems accurate to me that we are never going to find any experience that has its own independent essential nature. To take some obvious examples, you can't actually have high without low. There's no essential highness. It's only defined by low and low defined by high. You can't have hot without cold. In fact, we wouldn't be able to even articulate any experience without contrast, something that it's not. This is something of an alien idea to our culture. It comes out of a Buddhist view, but in our culture for probably at least a couple of thousand years, the main theme of our culture has been that we have an independent, continuing, essential nature, whatever we might call that, and that the objects of our experience have their own independent nature. But when we examine our experience beyond appearances, I think we'll find that everything is mutually co-creative. Everything depends on an incredibly complex number of conditions for its own appearance. By co-creative, I mean that all of our experience requires a number of factors to be experienced. We have to have our sense organs. We have to have the external world, whatever that is. We have to have our awareness. No one of those qualities can give rise to our experience all by itself. It might be just metaphorically like we were leaning some sticks up and using them to support each other. And when you take one stick away, it falls apart. Or you're building an arch, and it's the tension within the bricks that keeps the arch together. So whatever our experience is seems to be defined by what it's not. All of our experience seems to have a certain foreground-background quality. As humans, we tend to focus on what's in the foreground and what's moving. It's probably an evolutionary hardwiring that we have. But what's in the foreground is actually defined by what's in the background. If any of you are familiar with the optical illusion of the drawing of two figures in a box, and it could be either two faces facing each other, or it could be a vase in the middle. And our experience flips back and forth from one to the other. You can't actually hold both the vase and the faces at the same time, because what is in the foreground is actually defined by what is in the background. That's the way our brains work. So in a similar way, my sense of self is defined by not self. My sense of joy is defined by what is not joyful. Everything relies on this interesting tension and cooperation between what appears to us and all of the incredibly complex factors that support that appearance. But this really has to be approached through examination. If we just stop at our appearances, it's going to seem that everything has its own independent nature. So the view we're talking about is one in which we hold both the appearance and the analysis simultaneously. We don't choose sides. We don't say, well, actually, everything's just one big mess together. And we don't say, well, everything has its independent nature. Instead, we acknowledge that everything appears to have its independent nature, and upon examination turns out not to. The most fundamental experience that most of us are going to have of this co-creative experience of relationship will be that of self and other. And at the appearance level, it definitely seems to be that I am an independent self that has a continuing nature, and that everything else has its own independent nature, whether that's something that's inner, like an experience of emotion or perception, or something that's outer, like a person or an object. But again, upon analysis, we may find that there's no evidence that we can ever find of a separate independent self, or an emotion that has an essential ongoing nature. This leaves us, in my opinion, with a type of tension that is quite disturbing to most of us, but usually operates on a somewhat unconscious level. The appearance is that everything is separate, but on a more intuitive level, it's possible that we sense that that's not really accurate, that everything is relational. By not being able to take sides, if we hold our experience of myself being defined by what I'm not, by other experience being defined by its conditions and my perceptions, then we're left with no ground to stand on, no identity that we can count on as being permanent, and basically no solutions to life's disturbance. A familiar Buddhist summary of this view is not two, not one, meaning that it's not really accurate to say that everything is separate, and it's not really accurate to say that we're all one. Our appearances give rise to the feeling of separation. Our investigations give rise to the confidence of a lack of essential nature to anything. But it seems to me that most of us are somewhat unconsciously quite disturbed by this sense that I will never have a solution. I will never have an answer. I'll never have a ground that I can count on. And so the basic strategy that most of us seem to come up with is that we emphasize one or the other as our basic style of being in the world. Either we focus on self, which then gives rise to an experience of basic separateness, or we focus on other, which gives rise to an experience of basic connection. These two qualities of separateness and connection to me, are so fundamental and such a useful way of working with intimacy, working with relationship, that I'd like to say a little bit more about them. Almost all cultures are going to find some way to talk about these two apparently contradictory energies of separateness and connection. Many cultures relate the truth that we are all separate to masculine energy, and the truth that we are all completely interconnected to feminine energy. We might also call it yang and yin, or becoming and being. There's a lot of language that people use to talk about this tension, this dance between what appear to be contradictory qualities, but at the same time we sense are inseparable in some way. Some of the qualities of the energy of separation have to do with a capacity to rest in one's existential aloneness, to have boundaries, to assert needs, to allow other people to have their own life and not feel too involved with that. One sort of summary of that sort of quality could be talked about as integrity, a certain sense of wholeness or containment, that we are willing to be ourselves in this world and let others be who they are, but still stick up for ourselves. Some of the neurotic aspects of the style of separateness, the energy of separateness, have to do with a disconnection from others, a lack of empathy, a certain style of repression of feelings we don't want to feel, a type of insensitivity to others, isolation. In the extreme, we could say that the neurotic aspect of masculine energy is that of the perpetrator, where that person is so disconnected from their experience of connection that they're able to treat others as if there's no commonality. It's as if I don't need you, so it doesn't really matter how I treat you. The energy of connection has to do with the completely obvious experience that we're all interdependent on each other. It has to do with the qualities of empathy, accommodation, support, being willing to not have to be up there in front to let others' needs come first. Anybody who's been a parent knows that it's so important sometimes to just step into the background, but be there to pick up the pieces and support the situation. And that sense of connection and immediacy often could be referred to in a simplistic way as the experience of aliveness. We're open. We value our connections. The neurotic aspect of connection has to do with a lack of boundaries, an avoidance of conflict, a tendency to compromise integrity to purchase approval or love or security. And so the neurotic aspect of connection could be understood as that of the victim, where the person puts relationship as such a high priority that they have lost touch with their own self as being equally valid. So the stance of the victim is almost the opposite of that of the perpetrator, which is, I need you, so it doesn't really matter how you treat me. But we can see that for both of these energies, the neurotic expression arises when there is a fundamental split, a disconnection from the other reality. So neurotic masculine arises when there is a disconnection from the always present sense experience of connection. Neurotic feminine arises when there's a disconnection from the already present sense of basic aloneness and separateness. This is a theme that we'll keep exploring, the nature of this basic split, this dissociative split where we can pretend to not be aware of what is already present. The sane expression, therefore, of either energy would be when we are able to lead with one energy without losing experiential connection with the other. So sane masculine energy might be when we are asserting our separateness, having conflict, setting boundaries, knowing that we are alone in some fundamental way, and still keeping our heart open feeling our connection, our empathy with the person that we may be having conflict with, and understanding that we're probably having conflict with that person because they're so important to us. Saying feminine energy would be a leading of connection, a sense of communication, support, empathy, without losing experiential contact with the fact that that person is still responsible for their own life, for setting boundaries, that actually the relationship will not work well if they lose touch with their fundamental aloneness. In a very simplistic way, my experience is that when things are going smoothly, when things are positive in a relationship, that it usually works best to lead with our experience of connection while maintaining the experience of the fact that we're still on our own. This relationship is not going to save us, but we are focusing on our commonalities at that moment. In a similar way, it seems most productive to me to lead with the energy of separateness when we're in conflict with somebody, when we're dealing with our differences, because that's really what differences are. It's just the fact that we are separate people. That's what conflict is. Conflict is not actually a problem in relationship, just unskillful conflict. You can't have intimacy without conflict because you're two separate people. That's half the story. But healthy masculine energy will mean that we are willing to have conflict when we're dealing with our differences and keep our heart open to that person. But that's sort of in the background at that moment. Many couples get into difficulty when they're having conflict, but unconsciously continue to try to reassure themselves of their connection, and it just doesn't work very well. At this point, it might be helpful to give some examples of what I'm trying to describe. I work with many couples where one person, and it's usually the woman, but about a third of the time it's probably the man, but one person is in so much pain because they believe they want more connection. And they go through usually a long list of efforts they've made and how nothing has worked. They talk about how they keep trying to have more time with their partner, get them to talk about their feelings, but they haven't usually considered the possibility that perhaps as an experiment, what would be most effective would be to regain their willingness to feel alone and separate themselves. Because as long as they are the voice of connection, their partner doesn't have to make any connection. And if their partner has their own stylistic tendency toward wanting to be separate and have space, then they can just take as much space as they want, unconsciously comfortable, knowing that their partner will continue to try to make the relationship more connected. So often what the person who has this complaint about wanting more connection could experiment with is to step back and say what they would like, but stop doing the work for both people. One way I talk about this in clinical work sometimes is just to reflect back that this connecting person might have a style of doing 90% of the work. They're going to go overboard. They're going to overextend. They're going to keep trying to make things work, even when they start feeling hurt and exhausted. But if they have a style of doing 90% of the work, who are they going to find as a partner but somebody who has a specialty in doing 10% of the work? So one of the experiments they might make is to step back to the 50-50 mark and see what happens. And sometimes I suggest that that person first of all ask their partner if they happen to share the idea that a healthy, intimate relationship is one based on equity of effort, whether both people actually should be making roughly the same amount of effort and getting what they want about half the time and not getting what they want about half the time. And it's sometimes very helpful to set a reference point of equity as a way of challenging, at least on a behavioral level, this isn't deep emotional work yet, but challenging on a behavioral level this imbalance. But if both people have deeply contradictory feelings, let's say the person who's usually in the masculine energy position of wanting more separateness, let's say they genuinely want separateness, but they also genuinely want connection. But if their partner is always supplying connection, they don't have to, and in fact have to emphasize their separateness to maintain their own inner balance. Unconsciously, of course, but that's usually how it works. Or if somebody wants their partner to give them more space, a lot of times what they will do is withdraw even more because they want more space, not understanding that as they withdraw, their partner has an impulse to fill in the space and maintain a sense of connection. So again, in a counter-instinctual way, what that person might experiment with is initiating more contact with their partner. And it's possible that their partner's not trying to control them or smother them or anything like that. They just want the reassurance of connection. And so, strangely enough, if the person who wants more space is willing to initiate connection with their partner might be willing to agree to step back and not have a conflict when the masculine energy style person wants some time to themselves. Usually these styles have their origins, from a Western therapy view, in how that person as a child learned to take the best care of themselves possible when very young in their family of origin. There are a lot of scenarios, but let's say a very common type of scenario would be that if somebody has a parent, and often it's a mother at a very young age, but a parent who's perhaps over-involved or invasive or controlling or smothering or just is taking a lot of their sense of worth as being a mother or a parent, then that child, because they love their parent, because they're dependent on their parent, has to overtly agree with being available. But covertly, they have to then take care of themselves in a way that that parent is not allowing. So in this case, it might be that the child learns to accept a connecting partner, in this connecting parent, and appear to not have boundaries, but unconsciously, covertly, has to be withholding relationship, actually. This happens in a more extreme situation quite frequently when a parent has made the relationship sexual or has sexualized emotionally a relationship with a child, where the child has to say yes to the parent overtly, but covertly they have to find a way to have boundaries, to say no to this inappropriate energy. And so what often happens is that the child will unconsciously turn off and disconnect from their own sexual energy at a very young age, as a protection from having their relationship with their parent become sexualized completely. So then as an adult, this person might have a style of, let's say, having a partner who is invasive or demanding or controlling, and on the surface they're not having effective boundaries. They're apparently cooperating with it, but covertly they are actually withholding relationship. They're not available emotionally. And this can take a lot of forms. Somebody can sort of be there in their body and not be there emotionally, or they might appear to be available to their partner, but then always be going off to work or riding their bicycle or meditating or exercising or whatever they do, because that person has learned that intimacy is not about their needs getting met. So they have to then step out of the relationship. The flip side of that coin would be a child whose parent is very unavailable, whether they're overtly neglectful or working 3 jobs because they're in poverty or sick at the hospital, or their parents get divorced and their parents are very absorbed in that process. But when a child has a parent who's not emotionally engaged, it's very common that that child then learns that they have to be the one to make the connection if they want a relationship. And of course, as a little kid, they need the relationship. So then that person is trained into always trying to connect, trying to have a relationship. So then, as an adult, this person might mysteriously end up with a partner who is emotionally unavailable, because that's what they know how to do. They know, oh, relationships are about my doing all the work, my connecting. So in my clinical work, I don't happen to share the idea that it's necessary to go back and bring alive one's parent-child relationships growing up. I'm always curious about this, but anything that we have learned in our history will be manifesting in the present. But when I do talk with people about their histories, it's very, very common that the style that we bring to relating to our adult partners was learned as young children in our families of origin. And it's not wrong. It was the most intelligent, healthy thing we could do given those circumstances. But now we're in our 30s or 40s, and it's several decades out of date. We're trying to take care of ourselves, but we're doing so quite ineffectively. So it seems to me that all of life has to have these two basic qualities: the truth that everything is separate and the truth that everything is connected. There's no life form that doesn't have a shell or a skin or a membrane, that doesn't compete for resources, that doesn't have defenses. It wouldn't be a life form otherwise. And there's no life form that isn't completely interdependent on its physical and biological environment, and as humans, our cultural environment. So you can't really have life without these contradictory appearing qualities. And so it seems to me that it's extremely likely that you can't have healthy intimacy without these apparently contradictory qualities. The practical translation of that view is that healthy intimacy requires that we work with and respect and value not only our sense of connection with one's partner, but also our sense of separateness. So it's true that most of us genuinely want to give and receive love, to share our life with someone, to go to depth, to have that companionship. And it's also true that that person's not on the planet to understand us, much less take care of us. That the closer we get to anyone, the more guarantee there is that we'll feel hurt off and on. Most of us don't really want to compromise our lifestyle to accommodate a partner. Most of us don't, I think, even trust anybody on the planet with our vulnerability. So to me, healthy intimacy requires this unresolvable dance, tension, friction between deeply contradictory feelings, that we genuinely want to be close to our partner and we genuinely don't want to be close to our partner. But certainly in our culture, most of us are taught that intimacy is synonymous with closeness. So if somebody says, I want to be intimate with someone, they almost always mean I want to be close to that person. In fact, the pressure that most of us as couples feel to only be close is so strong that most couples in public try to present themselves as only happy, warm, supportive, enjoying their relationship, and so on, and they save their conflicts for being at home in privacy. And there's a certain type of shame, even, that many couples feel, that they're not meeting this cultural expectation that intimacy is supposed to only be positive and happy and close. So many couples, I have found, carry this burden that they're secretly not so close as they think they're supposed to be. And many couples feel this pressure, which usually isn't even articulated, that we're supposed to only want to be close to each other. We're supposed to always like each other. We're supposed to be happy with each other. We're supposed to be sexually passionate. This leaves most of us as couples in a type of dilemma, which is that we have to deal with our truth of separateness. It's not negotiable. In fact, healthy intimacy requires a conscious relating to the truth of separateness. But most of us as couples seem to be left with having to deal with our need for separateness in an unconscious, often symptomatic way. Many couples consciously try to be close and then unconsciously have to have a variety of symptomatic behaviors which distance them. I think that's unfortunate. My bias would be that if we want to be close, we communicate and behave that way, and if we want to be separate, that's how we act, without needing any justification for that. No blame, no apology. But in my experience, that's not supported by our culture, and there are some other reasons why it's quite difficult to do this. So many couples come to therapy actually claiming that there's a lack of closeness. In 30 plus years of private practice, I've worked with at least several thousand couples, and I can only recall maybe a handful of couples who have come in asking for more help in being separate. Probably 9 out of 10 couples are asking for help in being more close. And there are others that want help with parenting or something like that. But almost all couples come to therapy with the idea that there's a lack of closeness. And they haven't considered the idea yet that perhaps actually the problem is an overemphasis on closeness and a lack of conscious work with the fact that they are separate people. This cultural pressure is also supported by the fact that almost all of us as children in our families of origin, of course, had to put connection as a higher priority than separateness. We had to put the security of our relationship with our parents as a higher priority than our integrity. We can't say, no, I fundamentally disagree with you. I think I'll go find some other parents. No, little children have to do anything pretty much, especially when they're very young, to try to get their parents to love them, protect them, nurture them, not abuse them, not abandon them. And so all of us basically are trained in intimacy to compromise our integrity to purchase security. And of course, we enter adulthood with that training, very powerfully conditioned. So it's usually not, in my experience, until somebody's in their 30s or 40s that they actually have enough life experience, enough emotional resilience, enough confidence in themselves, that they even might consider beginning to put their integrity first for a while as a type of balance practice. And it's quite disturbing, of course, because most of us associate intimacy with closeness. And so it's very difficult to actually risk loss of relationship by acknowledging the truth of separateness. But it's already there. It's nothing new, actually. So this is the sort of basic condition that most of us enter adulthood with, that for family of origin reasons, cultural reasons, obviously gender reasons, women, for example, are pretty much taught, at least historically, that their worth as a person comes from relationship. And if they stand up as a separate person, they're often criticized rather mercilessly. Men are taught that their worth comes from their ability to stand up as separate people, go out into the world, take their hits, not complain, not be dependent. And if a man shows too much dependency, of course, he's often criticized. So there's psychological factors, gender factors, of course, ethnic, class, all sorts of things. But in Western therapy, we tend to look at our training in our families of origin, especially our relationships with our parents. So we enter adulthood, most of us, out of balance on a conscious level, identified with either being a separate person or a connecting person. It's extremely rare in my experience as a therapist that somebody doesn't have a stylistic imbalance in this way. And I'm saying imbalance because usually there's a disconnect from the other energy. It's not just choiceful. I think I've mentioned that my history made it very clear to me, as far as I can look back, that it was very smart for me to be as self-sufficient and independent as quickly as possible. And knowing my parents, knowing my circumstances as eldest son and so forth, that seems very likely that it was a very intelligent response. That I would guess that every time I showed a willingness and ability to take care of myself, I was rewarded. And every time I was dependent, I think it probably didn't have such a good outcome. So I definitely entered adulthood with a belief, a conscious belief, that I was very self-sufficient, independent, didn't really need others, and in fact put in a fair amount of energy in making sure that that was the case by learning to cook, learning to take care of myself, learning to handle my life skillfully. And for me, it wasn't until my 40s that it started to, I think, be safe enough to allow myself to begin to realize how incredibly dependent I was as a person. And I think one of the first clues was when I realized that if I were really independent, my partner wouldn't bug me so much. I wouldn't be so disturbed by that person. But obviously, her tone of voice, her behavior, how she related to me, was having incredible impact on my feelings. So this was quite a shock at that point to realize how dependent of a person I was. And many times I'm working with someone, it will become to me pretty obvious very quickly about a person's style. And so if somebody has a very self-sufficient style, I might encourage them to just say out loud, well, perhaps secretly I'm an incredibly dependent person. And it's the responses are very interesting, but there's usually a type of disbelief or revulsion or something. Well, but it's weak to be dependent. Isn't dependent bad? Are you saying dependent's okay? Or the flip side of that coin, if somebody specializes in always trying to connect and soothe and accommodate others, I might suggest that they say out loud, well, perhaps secretly I'm an incredibly selfish, angry person. Oh, that's so horrible. I don't want to be that way. That's a bad way to be. So when we start looking into these organizations, we'll usually find that we've had to not only suppress the half of the story, either being connected or separate, that didn't work as young children, but we've often had to attack that part of ourself to make sure it never comes up. So many of us enter adulthood with a lot of judgment, a lot of aggression toward that disowned half of who we are. And this is a very useful way of understanding codependency, because I think we could say that pretty much all of us enter adulthood predisposed to codependent dynamics in our relationship, obviously some more than others. But the basic dynamic of codependency is when one person hires a partner to be the location of or manifest exactly the energies that this first person has disowned in themselves, while the second person, their partner, has hired the first to be the location of energies they have disowned in themselves. So almost everyone I have known, either socially or in my work as a therapist, in their relationship, you can just see after a while that a person like myself who grew up disowning his dependency will mysteriously be attracted to and attract a partner who specializes in connection. And if it's a good fit, that partner will be hiring me to be the location of separateness. If this were only a conscious dynamic, it would be fine. It's a good division of labor. But most of us as children had to repress an aspect of ourselves, even attack it, and drive it into a dissociative, unconscious relationship. So we enter adulthood not choosing our style, but maintaining our style with a vague sense that somehow our survival is at risk if we don't do so. So a very, very basic theme of codependent dynamics is one where one person will be the voice of connection. The partner will be a voice of separateness. The connecting person will have the project, they think, of wanting more connection. The separateness person will have the project, they think, of wanting more space. At first, it seems like a really good fit. It's like we've found our missing half. So if I find a partner who specializes in connection and dependency, At first it might be, oh, this person is so playful and emotionally expressive and sensitive and nurturing. And after a few years, our fundamental aggression toward that energy starts to come out. At that point, it's like, gosh, why doesn't this person get a life of their own? Why are they such a leech on me? Why are they so dependent? Why can't they be more like me? And likewise, at first, the person who specializes in connection might appreciate their partner being strong and confident, able to deal with the world competently, be a steady support who's not going to get captured by their emotions. But after a few years, you're so unavailable, you're so insensitive. Why can't you be more emotionally engaged? And this is so familiar for couples. It's just an almost predictable theme in my work with couples, that there will be some version of this drama. And what we don't understand is that there's a certain dilemma here, a setup, that even though initially I feel like I found my missing half, it's only a matter of time until the fact that I am aggressive toward this part of myself, this disowned part of myself, will almost inevitably start to be expressed as aggression toward the very person I've hired to be that way, and vice versa. And so after a few years, most couples end up having to deal with a sense of polarization, almost an adversarial type of attitude, not 24/7, but it's a theme that just keeps on getting more difficult, where they are taking the position that they don't really understand each other. They don't get each other. But what we really don't get is that we have hired our partner to manifest what we are not willing to be responsible for in ourselves. And that's a lot of the work that I do in therapy. It's not the whole path of intimacy, but it's a lot of the work, because most couples come into therapy dealing with some type of codependent dynamics. It would probably be helpful, given the theme of our discussions, to just make it clear that codependency is not a thing. Codependency does not have its own essential nature. Codependency is basically an agreement that both people are making to ritualize their relationship, to try their best to strike a balance between not too close and not too separate. A couple wants connection, and they don't want to feel too vulnerable. The only problem is that in codependent dynamics, each person is not taking responsibility for this unresolvable tension within themselves. And so instead, this unresolvable tension over several years starts to be experienced as if it's between the two people. And the relationship itself starts to feel problematic. But each person is actually using this agreement to serve a function. And it's basically the same function that is served on an individual level, as we discussed in exploring the nature of neurosis, which is, how can I have a life without disturbance? How can I be close to somebody and not be vulnerable? How can I feel alive and not have to feel powerless or sad or whatever my vulnerability is? But this doesn't work. The reason it doesn't work, once again, is that there's a dissociative split, a pretending that operates on an unconscious level, that half of my experience is not there. It's not who I am. So we can understand codependency almost as like team neurosis. It's serving the same function, but actually it's another stage, another step in elaborating our strategy of distraction, of removing ourselves from our immediate embodied experience, because that experience is actually disturbing. It's disturbing to be alive. It actually is. Not always. So as we've talked about, the function of neurosis is to dissociate from, distract ourselves from our immediate embodied experiencing, and because it's serving a function that's important to us, even though based on inaccurate assumptions, which is that I can't really tolerate certain feelings. Neurosis is organized to make sure that it is never resolved. It's never dissolved. In a similar way, codependent dynamics are even another step of distraction. Not only am I in my own personal state of drama and struggle, but now I've involved somebody else, and they've involved me. So now the apparent disturbance is not even just in myself, but now it seems to be outside of myself, between myself and my partner. But in a completely parallel way, our unconscious investment in codependent dynamics is to make sure they never get solved. If they were resolved, we would be threatened with having to be responsible for our own difficulties, our own emotional vulnerability. But as long as we can point the finger at one's partner and say, you're the cause of my grief, my rage, my disappointment, my abandonment, whatever our vulnerability is, as long as we can successfully communicate, behave, think, feel as if they are the problem, then my attention is taken out of myself even further. And if it's a good fit, of course, my partner is concurrently blaming me for their disturbance and their pain. And a completely common theme in relationships is this fantasy that if only our partner would be who we want them to be, then everything would be okay. But the codependent dynamic requires that neither person actually effectively confront this dynamic. So when my partner blames me for something, unconsciously I have to make sure that I don't have effective boundaries, that I don't take care of myself. And if I blame my partner for my pain, my disturbance, then that person has to make sure they don't effectively have boundaries. So it's an unconscious agreement that I'll blame you and you'll blame me, and both of us will sort of complain about it, but we won't really take effective care of oneself. That's the deal in codependency. It works, just like neurosis works, and that's why it's continued. But there's a very big price tag, and just as personal neurosis over time actually can have incredibly damaging effects on one's sense of self and confidence about being in the world, the capacity to have joy, so codependent dynamics carry a price tag. And basically, as each person keeps blaming and feeling blamed without taking care of themselves, over time, love is killed. That's the experience. It's not really killed, but that's the experience. It's like if we keep putting knives into each other, it's going to have an effect over time. So even though codependency works in the short run, it actually leads to a deterioration in the quality of one's relationship over time. But because it works in the short run, and because most of us have not yet really decided to take responsibility for our vulnerability, our disturbance, our uncertainty in how to live, most couples allow their codependency to progress to the point where there's actually some significant problems in the relationship. And that's when most couples come into therapy. Sometimes it's, for practical reasons, too late. The couple has let it go to the point where love has actually basically been killed. But fortunately, many couples come with a sense that somehow they feel like they're torturing each other, but it's all unnecessary. But they just can't figure out what to do about that, how to change it. Before we end this session, I'd just like to mention that, especially for those of us who have done personal work in therapy and or in our spiritual path work, we often have a very strong hope or wish that we've left the dynamics, the pain and suffering of codependent relationship behind. But sometimes just considering this issue will be disturbing, because we find that there's still an aspect of our experience that is very codependent, very much gluey and sticky with our partners. If we find that disturbance, it probably means there's something there to look at, which is good, because if it's there, it's there. If it's not, it's not. But if it's there, we can't really work with it unless we're aware of it. So any disturbance about codependency, about anything, can be understood as exactly what we need to work with. It's a pointer, a red flag, a little signal that there's something unresolved there to look at and to experience consciously. In our next session, we'll continue our talk about relationships, beginning with a short discussion about 4 basic stages in our personal and relationship evolution. Then talk about some very specific views and practices that I introduced to couples that I work with some concluding remarks.